Hello everyone, this is our trading card presentation on John Rickford. My name is Abby and I will be giving you guys a general background on John R. Rickford. John Russell Rickford was born in Georgetown, Guyana on September 16, 1949. His education consists of a bachelor's degree with the highest honors in sociolinguistics from the University of California, Santa Cruz in 1971, a master's degree in linguistics from University of Pennsylvania in 1973, and a PhD also in linguistics, also from University of Pennsylvania in 1979. Presently, he is a linguistics professor at the Stanford University starting in 1980, and he's still with them today. As for his academic interests, the primary focus of his research and teaching is sociolinguistics. Rickford is especially interested in the relation between language and ethnicity, social class and style, language variation and change, Pidgin and Creole languages, African American vernacular English, and the applications of linguistics to educational problems. He is a variationist in the field of sociolinguistics, and his work helps categorize geographical and community-based variables which differentiate African American vernacular English within itself. Implications. These prove his ultimate conclusions that AAE and dialects are rule-based languages which should be subject to the same prestige as other dialects. John Rickford is also well known for his strives to standardize the social view of AAE, and this is best popularized in his book Spoken Soul, which is currently available on Amazon, iBooks, and Barnes & Nobles, now on sale for the holidays. I recommend everyone go get a copy.
Some of his most important works are his paper on Creole continuum, where he wanted to challenge the thought Creole continuum and variable rules don't mesh well, which showed how his personality was right from the start. Another article he published is Using the Vernacular to Teach the Standard, where he explores different ways to teach students how to learn the standard and what led to the failing of Black students in California, as well as where they compare nationally. His next study is similar, an early study of the speech of young Black children in California, Why It Matters. This is where he goes more in depth in what features are present in AAE, targeting the variation in California and comparing it to earlier studies conducted, as well as, again, how our current school systems fail AAE speakers, while also touching base on how the Oakland school debate affected how AAE was seen in the public light, as he was also contacted for linguistic insight for the school. In his most recent prolific study, Language and Linguistics on Trial, Hearing Rachel Gentile and Other Vernacular Speakers in the Courtroom and Beyond, he focuses on how the justice system and the public view of a person is affected when presented with the vernacular, and how those perceptions can affect the outcome, as well as how the vernacular can give character to a person even if it doesn't match how the individual actually is, as well as give people a grading of truthfulness based purely on those perceptions.
John Rickford is known for his work in African American vernacular English, and has written extensively in the genesis of this dialect. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about his work on this subject. Before I do, I'll have to define a couple terms. First off, a Creole is a language built up of two or more parent languages. It usually starts as a pidgin that is put together to unite two groups that don't have a common language. And once that pidgin starts being spoken by children as their mother tongue, a pidgin becomes a Creole. Creole is generally made up of a super straight language, which is the language of the dominant group and usually provides the lexicon, and a substrate, which is the language spoken by the less dominant group and generally provides most of the grammar. African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, is spoken all over the United States, and its origins are widely debated. On this subject, there are two main camps, the Creolists and the Anglicists. The Anglicists claim that AAVE was started without borrowing any language features from the Creoles that were common to slave communities at the time. And the Creolists tend to claim that AAVE had its beginnings either as a Creole itself, or that it borrowed many of its language features from Creoles of the day. John Rickford has written that these two theories are not mutually exclusive, but rather complement each other. In his 1977 publication, Rickford lists 6 types of evidence that are relevant to Creole origins hypothesis. Since this is a short presentation, I won't touch on what Rickford says about all 6, but I will talk about what he says about the first type of evidence, socio-historic conditions. In Rickford's 2015 publication, which can be found in the Oxford Handbook of African American Language, Rickford states that most of the original colonies didn't have a sufficient percentage of African Americans needed for Creole genesis, which is generally seen to be around 80% substrate speakers. However, he also states that since there are some linguistic variables that are present in AAVE that were not present in any British English dialects at the time, but were present in some of the Caribbean Creoles at the time, we must accept that AAVE at least has some influences from early Creoles. This is especially convincing since, as Rickford states in the same publication, most of the slaves that were brought over to the U.S. at the time were brought over not directly from Africa, but more often from the Caribbean. A good example of such a variable is the zero copula. This is probably the most recognizable linguistic feature in modern AAVE and can be found in such AAVE sentences as, "he gonna go for a walk," as opposed to the American Standard Version, he is going to go for a walk, or he is gonna go for a walk. This variable cannot be linked to any British English dialects, and so Rickford argues that it must point to a dialect shaped by the Caribbean slave Creoles at the time. It should also be noted that since many studies have found that the use of key AAVE features have been linked to socioeconomic status, copula deletion should be considered a sociolinguistic variable.
When talking about an environment that involves 2 languages, sociolinguistic analysis is inherently required to mark differences. The same goes for regions where 2 dialects are spoken. In 1985, Rickford believed the discussion on black and white language differences did not sufficiently reflect ethnic or social explanations. The majority of analysis consisted of variables like age, socioeconomic class, gender, or region. To introduce identity as a valid variable, Rickford went to the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia to study their language. These islands are famous for a Creole language known as Gala. On the island, only about 100 people live in isolation from the mainland. One of the participants, Mrs. Queen, is an African-American woman, and Mr. King is a white man, have both lived on the island for 80 years. They also share a similar socioeconomic background to the rest of the islanders, and most importantly, Rickford claims that both participants show an above-average frequency to interact with the other race. With the relative size of the island, he claims it's expected that they would show similarities in their speech. While they do in fact show similarities in their speech, like the passive use of got or get, there are distinct differences between the 2. Standard plural forms are almost rarely used by Mrs. King, at about 23%. Mrs. King also uses the unmarked passive, which Rickford claims is a classic Creole type. To explain these differences, Rickford brings up the island's history. In an earlier time when they both went to school, the island had about 500 people. They were also segregated at schools. This led Rickford to believe that they had a limited opportunity to learn and interact with the different types and constructions of the other race. Among the explanatory variables that Rickford studied, he points out that anatomical differences, which were historical arguments for differences in speech, are not significant at all. He also suggests that the linguistic origin of a participant's family or native language may play a role. He brings up an interesting point by saying that there's no reason why a person who grew up in a Creole-speaking family must be restricted to that language. He also claims there's no reason why a white member of the community doesn't need to assimilate himself with Creole speech as well. By proving that both of these members had a variety of interlocutors and were in such close proximity to each other in status, Rickford showed that socioeconomic class and geographical differences were not as significant as the difference in ethnicity. This related to an identity. He also claimed verbatim this had to do with the limited availability of opportunity and motivation for adopting the patterns of other ethnic groups besides one's own. And by mentioning this opportunity, He also indirectly suggests the importance of social networks. This showed that non-concrete variables such as identity play major roles in linguistic performance, and overall showed that sociolinguistics is necessary to analyze difference in language change.